Historia Regum Britanniae, or History of the Kings of Britain, is an account of the history of the Britons, starting with the Trojan migration to Britain and the inception of the British nation, and ends with the ascension of the Anglo-Saxons. The book contains an account of the invasion of Julius Caesar, as well as King Arthur, and is a central piece of literature for the matter of Britain. The History of the Kings was written by Geoffrey of Monmouth, or Griffith ap Arthur, in 1136, and was commissioned by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford. This provided a pillar of historical reference for Britain's understanding of its past until the 16th century, when Italian-English papal agent and humanist scholar Polydore Vergil rewrote British history under the instruction of Henry VII, who wished to wield the history of Brutus and Arthur for himself exclusively. Geoffrey has been slandered ever since. This includes accusations of invention of the information which has subsequently led the traditional British history to be censored and neglected. Contrary to those accusations, Geoffrey himself stated that the information for his chronicle was made available to him via the translation of a Breton script. Geoffrey's contemporary critics will say that no such document has been found. However, in 1917, eminent archaeologist Sir Flinders Petrie found the Breton document with a colophon attributed to Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, which vindicates Geoffrey of these alleged crimes. Petrie analysed this paper in his own paper, Neglected British History, and please stay tuned for a review of this document.
Hi everybody, welcome back to either the Matter of Britain or Britain's Hidden History, or wherever you're viewing this video. So today we're going to be reviewing an article, a document which should have been the document which changed everything in the early 20th century, to do with our topic basically. This is by a text analysis by a very famous Egyptologist, Sir Flinders Petrie. Who, you know, one of his lesser known elements of his career is that he spent a lot of time looking at what he calls neglected British history. He's known for his Egyptology and his discovery of the Proto-Sinaitic script, which is very important for us as well. But
I mean, the guy was hugely influential. He was one of the first to talk about creating pottery sequences.
Yeah.
For chronologies. He was one of the first to talk about, stratigraphy as well, and measuring stratigraphy when doing excavations. Like, just in terms of the basics of archaeology, the guy was a pioneer. But as you said, his surveying as well was a really big thing. He did some of the first really good surveys of Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid as well. It's a huge force in history and archaeology in the earliest 20th century.
Yes, absolutely that. And because of the enormity of this guy, his document and his appreciation for the Brut's history should have changed everything. I think Ross put it well when he used to mention that this topic was gaining a lot of interest before the First World War.
Yeah, absolutely. But Sir William Matthews Flinders Petrie. I mean, this is going to be really good. I think we owe a bit to Adrian Gilbert for this one, don't we? Because yes. I think me and you both knew this document existed.
Yes.
But Adrian Gilbert's brilliant new series he's doing on neglected British history. He mentioned this again, and it gave us a kick up the bum, didn't it, to take a look at it, Adam? Yeah. So thanks, Adrian, for that. Thanks a lot,
Adrian. Yeah, I'd recommend going and check out his new series for looking at in memory of Wilson and Blackett, talking about this topic, and he's got loads and loads. He's blown my mind, basically.
Yeah. And on this topic in particular, each one seems to be getting better and better each time he does one as well, and it's fantastic stuff. Geoffrey of Monmouth, of course, in his prologue to HRB, Historiam Regum Britanniae, he states that pretty much everything in the book comes from a small Welsh book that he was given, and that he decided to translate it not as dry, dull Latin, but something homely that people could read. And basically, it has pretty much been denied since day one that he ever had a small Welsh book that he copied from, he translated from. And the Brut which many people say is the Welsh book, or at least a version of the Brut, a manuscript version of it, is Geoffrey's book, but that has been denied by many people. And it's been argued that it is just merely a Latin abridgment of Geoffrey's work. And Petrie makes a brilliant and very convincing argument for that not to be the case, and to say that Geoffrey was telling the truth, and the evidence is there in the text. And that's basically what this is a side-by-side analysis of the Brut manuscript that Petrie was working from, and Geoffrey of Monmouth, with also Gildas and Nennius as well. So we can see, because there's no doubt that Geoffrey also probably used these two sources as well. And as Petrie says, there's some other influence as well at certain points. So this introduction, he's basically talking about his, he's incredulous. Why aren't people talking about Dark Age Welsh history, Brythonic history, and why aren't they using this text to do it? And I think that's basically what he's saying on this first page. But obviously, it's up there if people want to pause and have a look themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think an important element of that is actually the continuity between throughout the British world on reciting this similar story, and the similarities between them, because
absolutely,
you can't expect that kind of continuity in throughout those different regions. It's quite, unless it's the truth, or unless it's got truth to it. It's
so he doesn't really apply himself to any sort of political reasons why it might be ignored. No, not at all, does he? He
come to that. No.
He is just literally incredulous, and he says, "Well, the only reason I think it's I can't point in that paragraph break on the middle of the page, he says, I can only assume it's because of this idea that it's just an abridgment of Geoffrey and nothing else, nothing more than that."
And when Geoffrey is mentioned even today, that is the cap on the conversation, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
It doesn't go further than that. And this is I think the only academic paper I've seen actually challenging this. Apart from obviously Wilson and Blackett and our world, the world that we're coming from. But
absolutely,
in terms of established academic names, it's the only version of this which I've seen is trying to go beyond that.
Yeah, which leads me to my own incredulity, because I've looked at this topic, since I first got into this and was looking at Geoffrey and the Brut Tacilio, and I've seen a number of arguments of people trying to argue that Geoffrey just made it up and that Tacilio is an abridgment, and I've not seen one reference of this essay.
No.
This is an essay by Britain's leading archaeologist. For a long time, for a long period, he was one of Britain's leading archaeologists.
Yes.
Not just in Egypt, but he did loads of work in Britain as well. And the fact that this isn't even, I haven't even heard someone mention it to discredit it.
No.
It's just not mentioned at all, which is unbelievable, really.
I did try and look into see if I could find anyone refuting or arguing against it. Couldn't find anything online. So it's as neglected and ignored as British history is, and the Brut's history is. This is as ignored, it seems. It changes everything. We are talking about a Breton manuscript which has a colophon on it, attributed to Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, who asked Geoffrey of Monmouth to translate and write out.
And Petrie says here that the evidence is in front of us. We have this document. We have the proof it came from an earlier source.
Yeah. The next thing Petrie goes into here is that he decides to compare side by side the Julius Caesar's invasions between Bello Gallico by Julius Caesar, Brut Tasilio, Geoffrey, and see if there's anything else in Gildas or Nennius that could be where it can come from, or from other Roman sources as well that he looks at as well. Basically see what the information is, where Geoffrey could have got it from, and basically what conclusions he can draw from that.
Yeah, excellent. And one thing before we move on with that, just on this last page before the paragraph break, Petrie says it's a comment on the Celtic mind and how the Welsh and the Irish, he says, choose to remember their history, and he says that the Celts prefer literature over history, unfortunately. That you can take as, that in the west of Britain and in Ireland there is a way to remember history which differs from the established English mind, which is why London-centric academia has had trouble accepting Geoffrey because of its as Petrie puts it, flowery nature, or the flowery words of we've spoken about this before, but it's that is a what I understand as a bit of a cultural and psychological misunderstanding of, which leads to a mishandling of the documents, which sometimes is unfortunately fueled by political reasons. Sometimes, quite often. Right.
Let's not get into that on this one.
Well, I don't want to get into that.
We've got enough to do today.
Exactly. Petrie isn't getting into it. We don't have to get into it. We're just reading the document. Right. Okay.
So he lists the other Latin sources that he might dip into. Livy, Dion Cassius. All these people have some data about Julius Caesar's invasion that isn't in Bello Gallico. So he uses those as well. And as he says, without the Caesarian bias, because this is one thing, Bello Gallico is Julius Caesar in his own words, isn't it? And he's obviously not going to say too much that makes himself not sound very good.
It's seeing as his streak of good fortune came to a bit of an end when he tried to land in Britain.
So Caesar's first landing was a bit of a mess. He had really bad weather. I think a few of his boats were wrecked, weren't they? He had real problems disembarking, and there were even some Britons there to meet him, which made it a whole lot harder as well. And Caesar really waxes lyrical about it, saying, "Oh, this is terrible, and the weather was against me, and there were people there to meet us, and it was really difficult." And none of this is in Geoffrey or Tasilio. And if anything, it does, it would look pretty good for the Britons to be in there. They were not only there and ready and waiting for him, but he had a rough time of it. It's a good way to embarrass him, all this sort of stuff, and it's just not mentioned at all. So this is one of the things that reoccurs through this part of the argument, is that there's plenty in Caesar that would have been really great ammunition for Geoffrey, basically. Really good stuff to show how the Britons were great, and that Caesar was crap, basically. And it's just not in Tasilio at all, or Geoffrey. And he, I think we will get to there, but I think it's worth stating now is that Petrie comes to the conclusion that Geoffrey did not use Bello Gallico at all. considering it is the only document we have today, apparently, if we don't count Geoffrey or Brut, save for these small mentions in Dion Cassius and things like that, that means Geoffrey had something that is, important.
Yes.
He also makes the statement, that possibly that these the Britons that were there to meet him were like a small local force that had seen something was going on and isn't necessarily represented by the leaders of Britain, especially the leaders of the area where he believes Tasilio was probably written as well, because he feels like they should have had those details if that was the case. Yeah, so he goes in and he does several events, doesn't he, from Caesar's invasion, where he shows that they were either, as I said before, either really good places for where the Britons could have used this in their history as something to their advantage, but they don't for some reason.
Yeah.
So, including, there's also some places where the Tasilio and Geoffrey is more embarrassing for the Britons than it is for Caesar. And yet, nevertheless, it is in that. And considering that one thing that's leveled against Geoffrey repeatedly is that this is propaganda in order to make the Britons seem better. And yet, straight from this early example, it just does not do that compared to the Latin sources.
Exactly that. So if he was looking to do that, he would have been able to look into those Roman documents and
absolutely,
or just his advantage. So, but sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's leveled that he's fabricated the whole thing from the beginning anyway. So why write anything that's bad on the Britons? I mean, it's nuts. But as you say, he could look back at those Latin documents if they were available to him at the time.
Yeah.
Although I think the first copy of Bella Gallico wasn't really copied out until the 12th century or 13th century even.
Right.
So from a German monastery, I believe.
I see. Okay. That's good to know.
Mm.
But nevertheless, I think it does show that he is translating from a source rather than inventing it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
Brutus.
So one of the really interesting things which Petrie argues is the way in which some of the locations across the Mediterranean basin are noted and which order they're noted in. Petrie argues that firstly, he uses names which no one past 700 AD would use. Okay, to describe some of the goalposts along the way, and explains. I think where does he go into it? So the Salinae, which is a stretch of salt lagoon, is a place where you stop to get saltfish. It makes sense to stop off at these places, but you wouldn't call it that past 700 AD due to Arab conquestors renaming certain places. So it's this is an interesting element because okay, sure, you can retain that information and those names, but it seems to be the nature in which they're retained is along with this Brut Chronicle, which is talking about a whole migration from this area. Excellent, welcome back. It's a slight technical difficulty, but now we're back.
We're back on.
Cool. So I think so. Yeah. Aside from the presence of these older names for certain parts of the Mediterranean Sea and the voyage of Brutus being in there, we've got the presence of the Brutus narrative in Nennius as well. We were saying about how Geoffrey of Monmouth often gets accused of inventing the Trojan narrative or the Brutus narrative, yet it appears in Nennius, which is 9th century. He was writing in around 850, which the date given for the Brut Tacilio isn't much. It's not much before this, but 150 years before that. So to imagine that the Brut Tacilio is actually as old as that is claimed, I don't think is outrageous, and it just so happens to be the beginning of writing in that way for the Welsh, because we're talking about a culture who are very heavily in the oral tradition as opposed to writing down.
Absolutely. I think Caleb Howes makes an interesting point about Nennius, is that he actually gives us information about Brutus that Geoffrey doesn't. For instance, in naming him as, or locating him as the first consul of Rome.
Right. Yes.
He's very specific about who Brutus was in Nennius. But as you say, Geoffrey gets accused of inventing the whole thing, whereas Nennius not only gives us the whole story, but even dates it by telling us who Brutus is, which is very interesting.
So Brutus, being the first consul, what's his name? Not
Lucius Junius. Lucius Junius. Yeah.
Not the other one who assassinated Julius Caesar, but
yes. Who has a very similar name to Lucius Junius Brutus.
Yes, absolutely. And also had Phrygians fighting from, or Brigies fighting from as well. So that, I was looking into that. I thought it's an interesting crossover there, but seemingly unrelated. So what I think one of the conclusions Petrie comes to is that the Trojan thing, the Trojan narrative, must have come from someone who lived in Rome, a Welsh monk or a Welsh person living in Rome, who wanted to acquaint himself with the origin narrative of the Romans, which is why he used the theme of the Aeneid to do that. Now that throws up questions for us when we talk about, obviously, if the Romans come from the Trojans and the Welsh come from the Trojans, they must be kin inside. That theme with Tolkien's speech, haven't we? He identifies as a similarity in language. So I think Petrie might have been saying that might have been done in order to. It was used to be the origin narrative of Rome. So to graft the Welsh onto there, why would someone want to do that? Is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's the big question, which I don't think is taken very seriously at all.
And also, when would you want to do that? Because it could seem. It would seem to me that if it is fictional, and grafted on, then that would make sense as something to do in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd century AD. But going past that, it doesn't really seem like a very. It becomes an increasingly less relevant thing to do.
Absolutely. So if we're talking about doing that in the 1st century, which is when Petrie is suggesting, it's what I'm reminded of is the house arrest of Caradoc, and the whole epic and episode of his house arrest by Claudius. There's all sorts of questions you can ask aside from that. Saying things like, did they speak a similar language? If it wasn't a similar language, we're talking about a culture which was educated enough to have
Latin speakers. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All of these questions start to arise. And who exactly did the Romans feel like they were meeting, and who did the Welsh feel they were meeting on this on the Claudian invasion of Britain? because it's possible if you can attribute truth to the Brutus narrative, then they're talking about kin who are 500. They've been separated for 500 years, but they're going to recognize each other, the long lost brothers.
Absolutely, especially when the thinkers get involved. You know,
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it might not be immediately immediately obvious to two men meeting on a battlefield, but as soon as there's an exchange of ideas, these things will become pretty clear pretty quickly, I imagine. So I've just seen this bit under the paragraph break on notes to Tasilio, Nennius, and Gildas. You mentioned briefly this confusion between was it Durovellum and Duro? Durobellus, yeah, and basically saying that this this mistake is evident in Nennius, and so it means that Nennius must have been following Tasilio, rather than Caesar, and also and he says here, Caesar is never named as one of Nennius's authorities, so Nennius had some sort of was following some sort of set of documents, and the Tasilio and Nennius both are similar in as much as they're like compilations, aren't they? They've selected bits from they probably didn't have one document that they were just adding to over time. At some point, Tasilio and Nennius drew from lots of different sources, and this is evident in Nennius anyway, because he gives he doesn't just give the Brutus story as a founding myth of Britain, does he? He gives, I believe, he gives 2 or possibly 3 founding myths of Britain. The one that I remember, other than the Brutus story, is one that was very traditional in medieval Europe, which is to do with descendants from Noah.
Yeah, of course,
and the Old Testament patriarchs. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, we get that, definitely. I think we should do some stuff on Nennius. That'd be fantastic.
I'd love to cover Nennius.
Another interesting element of the Tasilio, however, is also the idea of British Jerusalem as well, and we get some very interesting sort of mentions in the Tasilio about Jerusalem being built in South Wales, or Caerhilsalem. So you get that narrative coming in the British Tasilio as well, which is another a very important part of when you're talking about origin narratives in Britain. It's in the Tasilio. So that's the length of that narrative in Britain, at least. And Jesus in Britain and everything like that. It's very old.
And I think he's going to go into Christianity in this bit as well, isn't he? Petrie deals with early Christianity as well in this essay. I think one of the there's an interesting point to make here about the year that Christianity first came into Britain. We have from Gildas, we have was it the last year of Tiberius? Is it
Tiberius?
Tiberius. And there are people who would argue that there's a confusion with, because some people say this is Joseph of Arimathea coming in. And we're looking at about 38, is it 38 AD? The last year?
38, 37, 38,
And one argument that people used to against this is that Tiberius was also a name used by Claudius. However, that also still puts it to around between 55 and 60 AD.
Exactly.
Which is exactly when Bran was meant to bring Christianity back from Rome. So on the one hand, we have Joseph of Arimathea. On the other hand, we have Bran bringing Christianity back from Rome. Both of which are generally sniffed at and sneered at. but we have our earliest British source, if you don't count the Tassilo, is Gildas, and he is saying as clear as day that it's got to be one of those dates. It's got to be. He is he's referring to one of those events. Unfortunately he's not as clear. Queen Elizabeth II certainly thought it was the first event of Joseph of Arimathea. Wilson and Blackett list several. So they talk about how you can push it back early. You can look at Lyrig, Lucius. You can look at Bran and Caradoc, or you can look at Joseph of Arimathea, and frankly, none of them contradict each other either.
No, exactly. No, exactly. They quite neatly work together. Actually, like
Absolutely.
you said, Bran.
Joseph of Arimathea purely could have created a small Christian community, which didn't have much of a wider effect on Britain, for all we know. And it was only the British royals coming back that really expedited the shift towards Christianity. But these are all ifs, buts, and maybes that we can talk about. But I think it's quite clear that Christianity came to Britain in the 1st century AD, not later than that.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've got evidence from that. In the video we did on British Christianity, we've got other traditions of other countries remembering apostles coming to Britain, and we've also got evidence of Tower crosses, which can be dated as 1st and 2nd century. So whichever way you spin it, we can't say that the Christianity didn't come here with Saint Augustine.
That's clear at least.
That and Petrie goes on here to talk about the Council of Arles, which I mentioned before, saying that British bishops were attending in 314, and I think that's one of the first councils. It's before the Council of Nicaea. It's about 10 years before, which is the first big one, which established the creed of Catholicism. So they're attending councils as respected equals at that point.
Absolutely, especially in Arles. I mean, Arles is not really far from, considering where these events could take place in the Roman Empire. Arles is not really very far away from Britain, and there's plenty of evidence of churchmen in France traveling to Britain, such as Germanus of Auxerre. This was something that was happening throughout this period. So I think I might have mentioned this before on an earlier one, but King Lyrig, Lucius, obviously there are churches in South Wales dedicated to Faggan, and is it Faggan? Yes, Faggan of Dyfran.
Yes.
Dyfran. And we know that, as we say, the British churches are named after their founders, so we can assume these church sites go back to the 2nd century. Also, it's interesting, there isn't a Lan Lyrig church, but there is a Lan Eirig church where the L's been dropped.
Happens.
And a while back when I first looked into this, it was so fascinating, because on their little church website, there's the story of the name of the church, and they say there's no records of a Saint Eirig. But the story is that he was a king who sent to Rome to be Christianized, and 2 saints came over and baptized him in the local river. But we have no idea who this person was. You think, well, they would just send you a copy of Tassilo. Exactly who he was.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's quite mad that you have this stuff on one side in the text, and they're saying, this is a fiction. It's the letters from someone else, and then you go to the churches and they go, oh well, we've got this story which is exactly the same story, but we don't know who it's about or who these people are. And you just think, wow, if you just draw these things together, and you've got not only textual evidence, but your place name physical evidence as well. Yeah, fascinating.
No, it is.
You only think that if possibly if Petrie's essay had been a bit more successful, we might be a bit more aware of these links.
Yeah, 100%.
In the general discourse, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't understand why it hasn't been. I mean, even in our world, you know, it took me until I was writing my dissertation to even come across it. You know, I'd never heard of it before. I mean, I hadn't read the Holy Kingdom at that point. I probably would have heard of it then. So, you know, but yeah, I've not heard of Petrie doing this at all.
No. Oh, this is a good bit here, Adam.
Yeah.
I'll just is quoting. Is not this the case of British history surviving at Rome, as in the work of Ponticus Verinius, who quotes writings of Gildas which are now lost?
Ah, yes.
Yeah, we've talked about Verinius, haven't we, in our own time?
Yeah, absolutely. So this thanks to Old Boy for this, who uploaded a video talking about this topic, and how John Milton, when he wrote his History of England, cited Verinius, who cited or explained the Brut's history and the Brutish migration to Britain in the first century as an original Greek source, which was translated by Gildas. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
and that's not in the documents of Gildas the document of Gildas that we have.
No, absolutely. You know, we didn't even know that Gildas did more than the ruin of Britain. You know, it's so there's more works from Gildas out there in translations which aren't collected. But so
it'd be really good if we can get hold of Verinius.
Be really, really helpful if we could get hold of that.
Yeah.
Because that would be. I mean, so I'm not sure if Petrie is saying here that that's where the source of the Brut's history is. Would you?
No, I think what he's saying here is that he thinks that Roman writers writing later are drawing from the Tasilio, about certain events rather than their own local let's just
scroll down.
Yeah, a little bit. So I think it's to do with confusion of names with Marcus Antonio Varellus. So there's some sort of it's here. So Bede gives the legal names and not the popular names, proves that he's quoting from an official document and knew more than his editor. Can it be supposed that Platina, about 1476, drew from Tasilio or Geoffrey? These details to simplify the Liber Pontificalis. Is it not the case? So he's basically saying that there seems to be an interchange of Latin and British documents, and that's his point about Verinius and about how names are made, and how that there must be earlier British documents coming out of Britain and being shared, in Rome. I think it was really interesting as well what you said about Verinius getting his Gildas copying from a Greek source.
Yeah.
Because earlier, for people who've paused and read it through, you will see that Petrie points to one of the spelling errors probably comes from where a Greek letter has been misused. So again, we have the fact that there is some sort of writing in Greek going on about the events of first century events of, Julius Caesar is not even first century BC, isn't it? Julius Caesar.
Before BC.
And it's he reckons it was probably written down in the first century, though. But it's interesting Greek is being used because even if there was a how should we say, the connection between Latin and Brythonic.
Yeah.
Still, even at that time, the Latin's go-to language, in fact, Europe's go-to language for a what's the word I'm looking for? Lingua franca.
Yeah, lingua franca
is Greek. It was Greek at the time. Yeah, they used Greek. They didn't use Latin. Greek was the lingua franca. I mean, so yeah, Latin was their official language that they did everything in. But if you were to travel to Egypt or travel to the Middle East or whatever, you'd speak Greek. And there were Greek colonies all over, Spain, southern France. So, and although obviously Rome itself grew in power and strength and cultural power, really the Greeks were the cultural leaders at the time. And yeah, so it makes total sense that if there were people recording things here in Britain, that Greek would be a language to be used. So that's interesting that that's come up twice in this essay, or from this essay anyway. Yeah. In all the period that we have been noting, there is nothing more than a florid expansion of Tassilo, except in a few fresh pages, mainly from Nennius and Gildas. So everything in Geoffrey can be found in Tassilo, except for a few in the period in question, the Roman period in question. Everything can be found in Tassilo, except for a few scraps which are in Nennius and Gildas. So although he definitely used Nennius and Gildas, he did not use any Latin sources. And then this is interesting. It's about the prophecies of Merlin and the Arthur's European campaign. These are bits. These are the prophecies of Merlin is clearly an interpolation. In fact, I think Geoffrey says, I intended to publish this in another book. And then he goes, oh, well, but I put it in here instead, or something like that. And these are two sections which are again used to sort of criticize Geoffrey and talk about him as it's and how the book is in itself is not doesn't flow properly because it's got these interruptions and it's got this mythical magical element. But it's clear the prophecies are a political statement.
Yeah.
They're a way of encoding historical information and a political message going forward. And Magnus Maximus's campaign, or should we say Arthur's European campaign, is clearly like he had this a separate document that covered the campaign. At some point, there's become this confusion between Androgathius's the name Androgathius and Arthur, and he genuinely believed he had another piece of Arthur's story, so he sort of bunged it in where he thought it should go. Petrie doesn't note in this that it's clearly Magnus Maximus's campaign, but several people have since, not just Wilson and Blackett as well. Quite a few academics and things have noticed that this is the same story. But I think what's interesting is that it shows that there was a version in Britain that talked about Androgathius leading the campaign, not Magnus Maximus.
Yes,
that makes sense. The detail, because that's where the confusion with Arthur comes. We have this Anthon or Anthon or whatever he might have been recorded in a Welsh version, and he's gone, oh bugger, where am I going to stick this in? Or I'll put it in. It just sort of feels right here, and I'll continue using some of the characters and things like that. Although there could be some other confusion with names going on there, but I think Petrie's point is that Geoffrey clearly says these are interpolations, and then after the European campaign, he goes, now back to my Welsh book, and Petrie's just saying, like, he says it there. We don't need to get like uppity about where these things came from or anything like that. He says it's an interpolation. We don't have to worry about it interrupting Thecilio's narrative.
No.
Because Geoffrey is quite clear about what is separate from the Thecilio text.
Nice.
So I think that's really important. We'll leave a link to this for anyone who wants to read it anyway.
Yeah.
Because it's brilliant and everyone should have a look through it.
Yeah, it doesn't take that long.
He notes one specific event where it differs from Julius Caesar's account. It does not show the Britons in a particularly good light, and it's confirmed in another Latin document.
Yeah.
I believe it's in Dion Cassius. I can't remember what the event is. I think it's to do with the siege. There's a siege towards the end where Julius Caesar was quite successful.
Right.
It might not even be in Julius Caesar either. So, but basically the point is that we have an event which is what's the word I'm looking for? It's confirmed by another piece of history.
Yeah.
But another piece of history that we do not believe that Geoffrey drew from. That there isn't any evidence that he drew from, and it doesn't show the Britons in a very good light. So it's a really interesting point that there is confirmable history in Geoffrey.
Yes.
That isn't propaganda and doesn't come directly from Bala Gallico or another document. And I'm sorry if I'm misquoting Geoffrey then, but if you find the section, it's quite clear the point he's making.
Again, doesn't fit in with this idea of making up a self-aggrandizing narrative.
No, absolutely not.
Okay. Cool.
Which is pretty much essentially what Geoffrey's contemporaries accused him of.
Yes.
And people later, not just his contemporaries, but right up till this day, people accuse him of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like we're 100 years behind.
Yeah.
Because
I know this essay should have really just stopped all that, shouldn't it? I mean, well, fair enough. It's fair enough. Things are always up for debate. That's fine. But I think this essay is brilliant for just sort of making brilliant arguments against these things and drawing it directly from the data from the texts as well.
Mythical matter, and also much that seems least certain in Thecilio, is distinctly borrowed by Geoffrey, as romance introduced by request, but not drawn from his ancient sources.
Yeah.
Thus, Geoffrey is fully justified when he begins by stating, Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, offered me a very ancient book in the British tongue, which related to the actions of all British kings, and ending that he advised other writers to be silent concerning the kings of the Britons, since they have not that book written in the British tongue, which Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, brought out of Brittany. For the end of the Welsh Thecilio is the colophon. I, Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, translated this book from the Welsh into Latin, and in my old age have again translated it from the Latin into Welsh. That such a work did exist long before Walter is guaranteed by the Brut Brynhennydd, written in Brittany, in the Breton dialect in the time of Athelstan, 925-941, by an insular Briton. All the main points of the story, bringing over Maximus from Rome, down to the fable of the 11,000 virgins, all these are to be found in the Brut Brynhennydd.
I would say as well that one thing I've thought of in the past is that even if Walter didn't have his original Welsh copy, he's going to assume that Geoffrey did a blinding job translating it into Latin. Yeah. So if there is any evidence that in Walter's Brut Thecilio that there's stuff from Geoffrey that doesn't come from anywhere else, it's probably because he used Geoffrey's copy in order to translate it back.
Yeah.
Because he's not gonna assume that Geoffrey's fictionalized anything or created anything. He's just gonna say, well, this is the document. I'm just translating it back. He probably used it as an aid for translation.
Yeah.
So I don't see. I never found that sticking point personally.
No.
And also the fact that, I just think this is brilliant that you've got Geoffrey saying, "Oh, I got this book from Walter," and everyone goes, "Nah, he just made that up." And now we've also got a document that has in Walter's own writing, "I brought this book over. I translated."
Literally. Yeah.
I mean, what more do you want, really? It's
What more do you want? He's clearly vindicated for me.
yeah,
He's working from a document we've got evidence for. As Petrie says, we've clearly got the evidence in front of us. Yeah.
There's a little bit. I mean, but my takeaway from it is that I get kind of annoyed when I see the idea of the Saxon invasion. It's either presented to us as it was a bloody slaughter where Saxons were invited in by Vortigern, and then they slaughtered their way east to west, clearing the lands and pushing the Britons back into the west, into Wales, into Cornwall, into Strathclyde or whatever.
Yeah.
And Gildas is used as evidence for this, despite the fact that Gildas is clearly writing a religious invective. He's not trying to do an accurate history.
Yeah.
And now modern evidence is showing there's a lot more mixing. There was cultural spread.
Yeah.
As we've said many times, there's plenty of Brythonic DNA in the traditionally Saxon areas. And what we're now presented with is the argument was, well, either it was a bloody slaughter or it was just peaceful cultural spread.
No in between. Yeah.
No in between. No possibility that there's grey areas in between, that we could have had periods of peaceful spread interspersed with pretty nasty battles and maybe even some rather unpleasant genocide even. Is distinctly possible as well.
Yeah.
One thing Petrie does quite well is show that in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the battles seem to be quite well spread, as if there were no sort of sections, no times of peace. Like, for instance, he's talking about Arthur's 20 years of peace. When does this happen? Because there seems to be battles spread out. But then he shows how the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a lot of the events happen on special Easter calendar years.
Yeah.
And that what's probably happened is that someone has spread certain events over a number of years to make the document basically look better and read better. And it's chosen certain years for their religious significance. Rather than how they probably appeared in the original annals which would have been clumps of events as things happen. And that makes sense. I mean, if you think about any war now, there's periods of extreme violence.
Yeah.
And calm periods. Extreme violence, calm periods. Things aren't spread out, especially if a Brythonic kingdom was being invaded, then that fighting would be happening, but other areas wouldn't be suffering. I don't know, but he does a really good job of showing how that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as well isn't God's word, like some people make it out to be, and that it's just as flawed as other annals from the period, especially for the periods in question that we're talking about, the 5th and 6th century. But also, getting back to my original point, is what Petrie does is, if we want answers about in what form the Saxon invasion took, just read Tasilio, just read Geoffrey of Monmouth. He says how lands were given over to the Saxons. He says how that sometimes the Britons worked together, sometimes that they were fighting each other. He says it's all quite clear. There's no dichotomy that we have to work out between genocidal violence and peaceful cultural spread. It's somewhere in between, just as the documents say it is.
Yeah, something which comes to mind is the fact that when I started getting into history in my younger years and looking at the the sort of formative years of Britain, the peoples of the island, and we got into the topic of Saxon invasion. In modern presentations, you don't even get the kind of presentation that they were invited over in the beginning by Vortigern, or that's not discussed. It's kind of you get this idea as the Romans left a vacuum, and the Saxons took advantage. That's the given narrative that you get, and then you've had people like Francis Pryor say, no, they came over gently, and it was gradual and all, and then you've had people really respond and say, no, we had it as an invasion. We came here, we fought, the Britons fought back. We're here by conquest. So I think this particular topic, especially the Anglo-Saxon invasion, very flavoured by politics, unfortunately. But actually, if you look back at the early chronicles, it seems it affords you that much more realistic and human depiction, which makes more practical sense. And so I might add, corresponds with the latest DNA findings, grave trends, and how.
Oh, right, yeah, okay, right, yeah, burial trends and things like that.
Burial trends. There was 80 graves which were assessed, and you found that you had Britons being buried in Saxon context and reverse, and also intermixing genetically, and people who had more British DNA tended to have more Christian burials, and more people had more Saxon. There's all sorts of intermixture going on.
Yeah. It's such a complex period, and I think we are so often just given we're given the most simplistic things and say, I'm told to pick one.
Yeah, absolutely. You are told to pick one, absolutely. Yeah. And I've seen people talk about this particular genetic study, which came up relatively recently, and it shows that these people argue that there was an invasion. There was an Anglo-Saxon invasion. It did exist, and it replaced. They claimed this is the thing that got me about it. They said the Saxons replaced 80% of British DNA in what is now England. However, that doesn't correspond with what you actually find in the graves, because so they're saying that an invasion happened, but a British invasion of England happened again. That's what they're arguing. I don't think that makes sense to me. It
seems like a complex answer rather than Occam's razor, or
yeah. It doesn't make sense. I'm pretty happy to accept that there was conquest. I mean, let's be real.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm not one of these people who are denying that the Saxons invaded, but to which extent it seems like what they found in the genetic data and the ancient documents do correspond, which is
absolutely
a little bit of both.
Yeah.
And that's sort of down the middle, but it's sort of based to me. That seems pretty based.
Absolutely, and things like this are rarely as simple as one or the other. You can't think of there's no examples from modern history about just clear people just storming across and murdering everyone in their wake and pushing them into a corner. It just doesn't happen. I think it's interesting about what you said about Vortigern's invitation as well.
Yeah.
Because I talked about William of Newburgh one of Geoffrey's contemporary, or not quite contemporary critics. I think he was a generation. Geoffrey was dead by the time he was writing. The section about Vortigern is the only section that he believes is accurate.
Really?
Yeah.
Right.
So if Geoffrey was just fabricating that, his contemporary critics certainly didn't think he was. And you know why? It's because it appears in Bede.
Yeah. Right.
And it's very clear, you know, if anyone ever says to you, oh, well, Geoffrey's contemporary critics didn't like it, ask them if they're talking about William of Newburgh, because his introduction to his history of England is basically a piece of political invective against Britons. It's very unpleasant, bordering on racist at some points.
It is, absolutely, yeah.
And he basically says, "Oh, if it doesn't appear in Bede, it doesn't happen." So those things that appear in Bede, Bede largely drew from Gildas, which is quite funny, especially for the periods in question. Yeah. But yeah, he confirms the whole event with Vortigern, you know, and says, "Oh yeah, that's very true. You know, that actually happened, but everything else was nonsense." It is really awful. I'll send the link over so you can put it in the bottom as well for other people to read, because if people use William of Newburgh to be a real piece of historical criticism, then that's not good history, because the politics of William of Newburgh are quite evident, and as I say, bordering on unpleasant at some points. So yeah, that's interesting that in it now, you know, if we're talking about how history works, and you know, we're going to ignore Vortigern because it's something from the British legends. Well, no, not always considered just to be so. So
yeah, absolutely.
Considered to be proper history even by critics of Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I can never pronounce his name. Ammianus.
Yeah.
Ammianus describes the Saxons and Franks ravaging Britain in 364 and 368, and a defeat of the Saxons in 374. I think this is interesting because this is when Britain was going through a period of usurper emperors, the emperors of the West, and I think when you look. And the idea I get from looking at the documents with the Roman withdrawal, people like to, you know, talk about the withdrawal of the Romans leaving Britain. It seems clear to me that the British elites were fed up of paying for something that they weren't getting.
Yes,
they were paying for Roman soldiers to defend their country, and they weren't getting that defense. And it seems clear from the records that they booted out the Romans because they were not getting what they wanted. I think by that time, probably by the end of the 4th century, probably before 410, you know, this sort of period they're talking about.
Yes.
The Roman economy would have collapsed in northern France. So Britain not only would have not have had the benefit of the Roman trade, but they wouldn't have had the benefit of the Roman soldiers either. And they were sick of it, because they were constantly getting hounded on the East Coast by the Germanic tribes. Looks like the Franks were coming up as well from the south. No wonder the southeast of England was in tatters by 410.
No.
You know, I think that was well on the way of happening before 410. I don't think it collapsed overnight, you know, just as soon as the Romans left. I think it was already on that way. And do you know what? I imagine there probably were some Saxon settlements before Vortigern invited Hengist and Horsa over, even if they were only, you know, basically pirating strongholds or something like that.
It's probably better to invite them at that point rather than let them, you know.
Absolutely, yeah.
Bring a little bit of land which was boarded off and sectioned to say, well, I'll give you that bit. You can have Kent, so long as you help me fight these buggers up.
These other ones, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, makes sense.
And especially because I think these were the elites in Western Britain who, frankly, had their own stuff to deal with in the West. You know, they didn't have time to deal with the Saxon shore. They had Irish to deal with. They had their own business to attend to, essentially. And I say that I think they were they were sick of dealing with it. So the Romans had to go because they were paying for something that they weren't getting.
Yeah, absolutely. Very different story than what you're given in the mainstream today, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's written. I haven't just made that up. It's written places that the Romans were asked to leave or rejected.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, triads, exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. As the historical triads have been quoted here, it may be expected that some notice should be taken of their value for history. Yeah, I should think so too, Petrie.
Absolutely, damn right. Yeah.
That the British mind preferred to group persons and facts in threes as an aid to memory is analogous to the preference of Plutarch for pairs of similar characters, or of the Indian mind for groups of 4 and 8. It has nothing to do with the authenticity of the information thus classified. It obviously is seldom that there is proof of early date of settlement, while it may have been made long after the event. We can, however, certainly put Triad 65 of the ports of Britain before AD 450, as it mentions the port of Gwyddnow in Cardiganshire as one of the 3, for number 37 describes the flooding in the time of Ambrosius of Gwaelod. So that's the lost cantrip, isn't it?
It is,
yeah. Which is a great triad, isn't it? We'll have to do that at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which was the domination of Gwyddnow, king of Cardigan. Another dating is of Triad 64, naming the 3 capitals where Arthur has supreme authority. St. David being chief bishop, born in 462, and Maelgwn of North Wales being chief elder. This must have been written before Maelgwn became king in AD 500.
Yes, I prefer later dates for both of these characters anyway, but I think the point remains the same.
Yeah.
That it's after Maelgwn is king, unlikely they're going to have a triad written in the area saying that he was supplicant to someone else.
Yeah, well, it is quite unlikely, isn't it, really? Yeah, absolutely. These things are constructive retrospectively, aren't they?
Yeah. In certain places, like Dara and Bernicia, are being referred to as British in Triad 7. And obviously they were some of the first Angle kingdoms. Whole collection must be before Edward I, as his conquest of Wales has left no trace here.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a great point, isn't it? Because we're this makes me think of Prydain ep Eighth Mar. I know you've said to me before about difficulty with that one. Being one of the ones in is it Maverian archaeology, or was it just one of Yolo's?
They're the third series. They call them the third series of triads, which is or Yolo's triads. Yeah.
Right.
But I don't have a problem with Yolo's triads.
No, of course, neither do I.
I mean, I think if anything, for me, the worst things that Yolo did were probably only as bad as what Geoffrey did. Is that he took something and he made which he may have not have quite understood, and made the best of it that he could with the information that he had.
Indeed, and he had to make copies of a lot of things which people weren't going to just because hand over to him. This randomer knocking on their door, and what else with Yolo? I think it looks like one of the most damning accusations that he has is forging some poetry, but it might actually be that he was just taking on the mantle of was it Dafydd Gwilym?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So it's
which
you
is
know,
something that Welsh bards did since Taliesin, is take on the persona of a you know. I saw a good video by David Gwilym Morris, actually.
Oh yeah,
Gwilym Morris Baird. Sorry, I got Daffod up Gwilym and Gwilym Morris Baird. And you know, he was saying that it seems like an odd thing in a Christian country to sort of, you know, to raise the dead, you know, or to inhabit, you know, let these souls inhabit you like possession or something. But it seems like something that very much was a big part of bardic tradition. So and people say this, and even in the same breath, which is remarkable, is they'll say, oh yes, it's very traditional for Welsh bards to take on a persona of a previous bard and write in their way, and then they'll go, but Iolo forged poems by Daffod ap Gwilym. Be like, what? Hold on a minute. What's going on? But and there's also, if you can get a copy of the third series of Triads, which isn't easy, folks, unfortunately, but if you do, you will also see plenty in there that is not controversial, that isn't wildly unbelievable or anything. And you know, and there's other bits. You can see a fantastic Wikipedia entry on Hugh Gadarn, and at first the first paragraph is about how Iolo invented Hugh Gadarn, and then the next two paragraphs are all the examples of where Hugh Gadarn appears throughout the centuries in Welsh tradition.
Wow. Yeah.
You're like, wow, that is an amazing piece of doublethink. That is.
It's quite
Orwellian doublethink at its prime.
Yeah, 100%. You see it quite a lot, don't you? It's quite concerning. Cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Cool. Right. This was interesting. Talking about the laws, and I think Petrie was suggesting that some of the laws in Britain have a pre-Christian nature, which were preserved in the laws of Dynval Molmud.
Yeah, it's an old dating Dynval Molmud is difficult. And I think that's something we're going to have to look at some point.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
I think Wilson and Blackett certainly put him in the 4th century, but traditionally, Geoffrey puts him pre-Roman.
Right.
I believe Adrian Gilbert in his latest video referred to him as pre-Roman as well. So if anyone ever tells you that Wilson and Blackett just do things you want to hear, they don't, because you know, a lot of people think of Dynval Molmud as a pre-Christian king, but I think in Artorius Rex Discovered that they deal with it, or they refer to it as a they do refer to it, but it's something I'm definitely, before I say anything for certain, I need to look into it myself. So I could be wrong on that, but it's something we're going to have a look at. But yeah, the Molmutian laws are fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to dive into that at some point. We should do that.
Yeah.
But according to Petrie, he goes into it and says that the condition of pagan Britain is remarkably preserved in the laws of Dynval Molmud. That these laws are currently long before the 10th century is proved by the gulf that exists between the state of society shown by them. That the laws of Howell fixed, that's Howell fixed to 914. The laws of Howell show a highly complex and detailed condition of law and an elaborate royal court with the rights of officials minutely fixed. In the laws of Molmud, there is very simple law, always subject to proof, customs, and adaptation to circumstance. It's interesting. There is no royal court, and and very few officials with no divine claims. Moreover, the laws of Howell refer back to Monmouth. What takes the laws of Monmouth to at least Roman times is that they are purely pagan, and the only Christian allusion is an addition to the forms of legal oath, saying that in subsequent times, the form of oath was given by the Ten Commandments to the Gospel of St. John and the Blessed Cross. This stamps previous oaths and the rest of the laws of the pagan period, and therefore at least 3rd century, as British bishops attended the Council of Ireland 314. How much farther back these laws may date towards the traditional time of Monmouth in the 4th or 7th century BC, we cannot now inquire. Probably there were a gradual accretion, but apparently no part comes under the influence of Christian usage. We can then at least accept the picture of society here shown that of the Britons under the earlier part of the Roman domination of the two legal series of the triads. The first short series 1 to 34 here marked A1. The long series is simply numbered 1, 2, 4, 8. Skene agrees to the laws of Howell being of the 10th century, but never mentions those Monmouth. Stephen asserts that the laws of Monmouth were certainly not composed earlier than the 16th century. What writer of that date would forge a consistent body of primitive tribal law entirely pagan in character, and why anyone should do so when the laws of Howell were celebrated and prized are questions ignored by the easy assertion of the date of a late date for which no reason is given.
Brilliant bit of logic.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. Absolutely is.
I mean, this is at a time, we're constantly told that, the stories of Joseph of Arimathea are, etc., are, what do they call them? Holy fakes or something like that.
Yeah.
There's like a word for it. It's something like that. Holy fakes. Let's go with. Now, if you were going to be writing about this very early period of Britain and forging something, especially during the late medieval period, you would make it a holy fake. You would fill it full of Christian law that is just so characterful of the time. So yeah, I think that's a brilliant piece of logic that Petrie's put forward there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, great. He goes on a little while after to talk about Welsh society, how it remembered in Howelldar, the laws of Howelldar.
Of course,
to accept people in, travellers in and on their way, give them everything that they need for their journey. Sort of quite egalitarian, quite a lot of equality for women as well. All of these hallmarks of a society which, is said to be barbaric a lot of the time.
Yes, yeah.
In comparison to what the Romans were like compared to the Britons, in the.
I think with the time of Haldar as well, I think even compared to the Saxons, I think this was quite progressive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially as you say in terms of women. Saxons and women didn't have a great place in Saxon society, and I'm not saying they had an amazing place in British society, but it certainly seems like it was more egalitarian, as you say. I've also read a really interesting section about slavery as well.
Right.
Yeah, and slavery was no doubt a big thing for a long time on the British Isles. Especially the Irish Sea was known as a real slavers' sea, between Wales and Cornwall and Ireland, obviously. But there seemed the argument I was basically reading is that all these people are slavers, but leaning towards the end of the I was about to say the last millennium, but the end of the last millennium was only 30 years ago. The millennium before that, the time of Haldar, the 10th century, Saxons were much bigger slavers than the Britons were.
Right.
Yeah, considerably so, especially because a lot of their slaves were Britons as well. Which is the idea of why Welsh can mean slave.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I just thought I'd throw that in there as well.
Yeah. So just have a quick look at the Monmouthine laws, which are in this document. You see a few tribes that are cited by Petrie, which give us a little feel of what's going on. So the tribal bond is broken up by famine, earthquake, or flood, or conquest, and the tribe must be given a new form or social state. Interesting law there. Because going back to what we're saying in the last video about identity and the possibility of within the church, the Israelite identity, and how that might have shifted, and what's happened in history since. And we've got a law here saying that a new identity or a new state must be instantiated upon natural disaster or cultural disaster. So that could add in why potentially those sorts of ideas might have been forgotten by some, much to the dismay of Gildas, who was writing then. In more personal matters, no arms might be shown in a convention or the country and lord, or convention of independence or convention of the bards. So you can't just brandish your sword around at an event. You can't just. This is about showing respect. This is a kind of to be humble in these and makes me think of the Night of the Long Knives, which is a peace conference between the Saxons and the Britons, which the Saxons famously drew out knives and sort of massacred the Britons at the conference, which would have been against the British law that was instated at the actual event. The things indispensable to a free man were his tunic, harp, and kettle. Brilliant.
Same.
Yeah. The indispensable of a vassal were his hearthstone, billhook, and truff. So it's like these are protected items. You don't mess with the man's kettle. Don't mess with the man's truff. It's it's written down that these elements are, it would be bad. It wouldn't be cricket to take that away from someone. I guess it's your survival. So it's like fair game. Don't touch those things.
Yeah.
The property of a man, property of which a man might not be deprived, were his wife, children, clothes, arms, implements of the privileged arts. Another great indicator of culture, which is very passionately protective of producing culture, something we don't see today with our government.
No, true.
It's like the complete opposite today. It's so the generation of art and culture is something which the Welsh understood as something which is essential.
Yes, and to be preserved and protected.
Yeah, fascinating. Three ornaments of a tribe were a book, a harp, and a sword. So we've got, this is, you could even look at it as a symbolic way there, a book, that's strange to me to see that in there actually. It's something which, we're often told that the Welsh and the Britons actually preferred oral tradition to the written word. But anyway, it's in there. A harp. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just my only thought that it's a book. Which,
Okay.
Yeah. So
okay.
If your tradition is entirely oral, there might be one man who's allowed to look after the book and looks at the book and puts things in the book.
Yeah.
Which is probably has things like genealogies and
okay, right, I'm with you. Yeah, all right.
And these will be like the essential things, and then I think that's. I think it's interesting that book is in the singular, because I think that possibly gets around what you're thinking about the oral aspect of the culture.
Brilliant. Yeah, right. Hereditary owner of the land could always reclaim it after sale by offering the value. Right, so you had first dibs on land which was your ancestors.
Which means the genealogies are very important.
Yeah, absolutely. This goes back to the gravel kind in which John Sadler claimed was the one of the remnants of the Trojan laws in Britain. So land and your ancestry are extremely important, and this is one of the ideas that you're married to the land in some sort of way.
I think that's interesting. It proves private ownership and tillage was
right
happening, coexisting. I think that's really interesting. So you could have several classes of people operating and owning land, which I think is really interesting.
It's a very, very it's very, very progressive in many ways, isn't it? The chief was the oldest efficient man in the tribe. That's a really important one. This is all to do with the fitness of a king to rule, and also it ties in with the Fisher King motif of the main. A Welshman, a Welsh king can't be the king, and this is potent. He's virile, and but it also translates to how are you working with the land, how are you working with the people, how are you offering your wisdom. You can't just be a king just because you're old and you're the oldest one. It doesn't work like that. You've got to be competent and skilled as well. Interesting. The meeting of a country could be called by public proclamation, not only by the king or lord of the district or the chief of a tribe, but also by a family representative. So meeting of a country, right? It's like, the motif of Arthur being High King of the Britons, for example, is an idea which is rooted in the British law, and that you could unite the country. There was an idea that there was a country and countries within that, but it was ultimately a sort of loose confederation of a people.
Confederated states is certainly how I think about it. I mean, there's something that I've been thinking about for a while. Think about those hilltop cities of Italy of the Roman period. Essentially like individual city-states, which very strong theme in Italian history right up until the unification.
Right.
But within that, they were a shared nation, culture, language. And then if you think about Britain, what do you have? Bloody hilltop towns yet again.
Yeah.
With individual states which seem to share a culture, nature, history. It's not a crazy leap. I don't understand the resistance to the idea. It's there's always, as you say, there's always this idea to what's the word I'm looking for? Make it seem as small, make it seem as parochial as possible. You know, well, if the Britons are talking about this, they're just talking about one small aspect of the country, one small bit which they might know about. There's no internal cohesion between the states. They're always small parochial bodies of chiefdoms, you know. But that's not what any of the history says. It's certainly not what the history after the 6th century suggests either. You know, by the end of the 6th century, you've got Saxon kings calling themselves Bretwalders, meaning high king, you know, of Britain, or at least of the Saxon states of Britain.
Interesting.
I this is, you know, and that is not something that they invented. That is something that they
no, it was an assimilation, wasn't it? Almost, it was an replication of British law. It seems. You know, that seems very British to me. Yeah, really cool. There were 3 privileged conventions. The first, that the bards for sound instruction on virtue, wisdom, and hospitality, to record events, actions, and pedigrees, and proclaim laws. Second, that of the country and lord for court law. Third, for independence, to establish harmony by mutual reason and agreement of country and country, prince and prince, vote and vote. So there's an old British Druidic axiom which says, he who wants to be king must first be a bridge, which seems to re-represent itself in this law, which is talking about finding a sweet spot between disagreements and peoples of different factions, which seems like a very healthy sentiment to represent there. It's really cool.
And it goes back to our previous point about they can have their own local political things going on.
Yeah.
Which are not necessary, you know, it's not like the whole nation goes, oh, this is how we're doing it, this is how you're doing it. It's like, oh, right, that's your way of doing it, this is our way of doing it, let's try and work out something in between. You know, just like you were saying about sort of like loosely confederated states, you know.
Yeah.
The state has its own power to rule itself locally.
Yes.
But there are certain federal laws, which is what the Monmouthian laws are, which govern and help create, you know, engender good relationships.
Yeah.
Engender discussion, engender, you know, so everyone benefits and not just one state or another.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also you've got in there a kind of this idea that the bardic tradition is something to be preserved by all means, because they can. These are the people who have. They're the lineage of wise people in the country, tasked with recording the memory of the people and therefore the rights of certain people, you know, and they're the ones tasked with officiating that.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool. The consent of the country was needed to abrogate the king's law, to dethrone the sovereign and teach new sciences and new regulations in the convention of the bards.
So basically you needed agreement amongst the entire nation,
yeah,
before doing any of those things. So if you wanted to dethrone the sovereign, everyone had to agree on it. Teach new sciences and new regulations in the convention of the bards, you had to all agree on it, which is interesting if you think about Christianity.
Yeah,
because it meant that there had to be some sort of national agreement
to instill the religion.
And to instill the religion. Is that exactly?
Wow. Yeah, that's a great
brought
point.
in part of the so when people talk about the spread of Christianity in Britain,
yeah,
you know, they always talk about it very regionally, but if the Monmouthian laws were in place, then there would have had to have been some sort of national
agreement on that.
understanding.
Yeah,
So that's interesting.
that negates the regional thing, definitely.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Cool. The native rights of all freeborn men and women were the gift and free use of 5 acres of land, which is 8 English acres, the carrying of arms, and a vote to a man at puberty and a woman when she marries.
I mean, it's sad that the woman has to get married first, but the woman having a vote is something that we didn't have in this country at all.
Yeah.
So that's pretty fantastic, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. It's that's really interesting, and also,
and the women were landowning.
Yeah, absolutely. This is ancient. These are ancient. Yeah. But it reminds me of the marriage thing. Reminds me of a law which the bards and later the British clergymen had, which was they had to marry before they had to be married before being taken seriously. So marriage is a very special part of British society.
And seemingly as important. What's the word I'm looking for? As important in religion. Sorry, sorry, I've forgotten the word. Non-religious.
Yeah.
It's a legal thing as well as a religious thing, and the importance of law as well as marriage as a legal aspect of your social position and your position as a free man is not just about the union of Christian people for the benefit of procreation. It's
yes.
There's a cultural and societal aspect to the marriage as well. That's fascinating.
Seems inextricably linked with the stewardship of land.
Yes,
which is something which comes up again and again when looking at the ancient Welsh way of life, which is, well, I can get behind that personally.
Yeah. I'd love it if someone gave me 8 acres just for going through puberty. I'd be well chuffed.
I'd need it to drift round
I need it
or something like that. Yeah. Oh, brilliant. A woman also had the privilege that if she had a son by a foreigner against her consent, as when in the power of foreigners in any way, by tribal order or accident, her son inherited as a free man, although a foreigner, could not inherit privileges for free men for 9 generations. So that's again quite humanistic.
Yeah.
A foreigner doesn't get the same rights for 9 generations, just for contrast to show how they treated that sort of thing. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think it also shows why invaders were so keen to marry into Welsh families.
Yes,
because their sons would get all the privileges of being free men. They might not necessarily get them in Welsh culture, but you're as far as they're concerned under Monmouthsian law, your children are Welsh.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. I'll put the link up for anyone who wants to just go through all of these. There's so much to go through in here, and I said earlier, it doesn't really take that long. It's 28 pages, 24 really. But another example of how the arts and learning were treated in Britain is visible in this one, where it says learning was greatly respected, privilege of support was given to rank, to bards or teachers, and to orphans. So that this goes back to the druidic thing as well, because the druids were non-combatants. They were exempt from paying tax and from fighting. So that's something that they retained. Also, that the free man must support a wife. The free man must support a wife, also a fighting man if he does not fight himself, and a family tutor. Again, so it's putting energy into defense slashing, expansion, expanding efforts, and also to have someone to teach the children, or have a kind of input.
Yeah, I mean, it's like education is again, this is something that we didn't really get until 20th century England. If you are a free man and you have children, you must support a tutor to educate your children. Your children must be legally must be educated. I mean, that is fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. The privileged arts gave complete liberty are bardism, metallurgy, and learning literature. So, yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. So the idea that you're not really an adult until you've had an education, almost, isn't it? That's fascinating.
Metallurgy.
Yeah.
Again, this is very archaic. It's teaching and learning, and we'll lump bardism in sort of with that, and metallurgy. They are the those are the things that are placed with importance.
Yeah.
I think that's, that's, sorry, I can't even get out what I'm trying to say. It seems very archaic that is the things that are that pointed out. Metallurgy, yeah, literally meaning, well, alchemy could be another word for it, but you wouldn't think of a smith, or a blacksmith as being like you're a protected freeman. Not necessarily in the later medieval period, but at a time like the Iron Age, it's virtually a magical art. It's something that's still seen with reverence or something. So for me, that law arguably dates this to early.
Yeah, absolutely. So to summarize, then, there are 10 points on which Petrie extracts from this and thinks is you can take from it, which is, one is that the British record of Caesar's attack, written in entire ignorance of Caesar's account, but closely according with it. Very interesting. The British account was the basis of the chronicle of the kingdom of Gloucester, and passed into the history known by the name Tasilio. That the Brut legend was written about the time of Claudius. That there is nothing improbable in all the relations with Rome, at least down to the 5th century, as represented by Tasilio. That the statements of marvels by Geoffrey are carefully withdrawn by him from historic materials and treated as fabulous. So number 6, that there was no doubt as to the dependence of Geoffrey on water, and of water on an earlier manuscript, probably Breton, for the British history, as stated by those writers. I don't know why he's saying probably Breton, because he's said quite distinctly that it was from, the manuscript was from Brittany. But
I think possibly the problem is that even if it was found in Brittany, it might not necessarily be a Breton manuscript.
Okay, cool.
It could be from Cornwall, it could be from Wales, and if it's from Cornwall, it would possibly be indistinguishable in terms of it could be indistinguishable in terms of language from a Breton manuscript. That could be what he's alluding to. I'm not sure.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, cool. Right. And 7, that the Hengist invasion is dated by Celtic sources to AD 429, and the Saxon date is in error. Arthur reigned from 467 to 493, thus rendering possible the account of his French expedition.
Yeah, so he's talking about the Magnus Maximus.
Yes.
His European campaign. So, and I think this could be maybe where this comes from, of that really early date from Arthur. This could be what Petrie's alluding to is where quite a lot of people, they look at the European campaign, look at the Saxon campaigns, and go, if we put Arthur around the middle of the 5th century, we can kind of get away with him fighting Romans and fighting Saxons.
Yeah.
But I think once you understand that the European campaign is an interpolation from a separate history about Androgathius, Arthur won, then that
it fits
that dating changes, and that doesn't it's no longer an issue, should we say?
No, yeah, absolutely, yeah. It's very. I mean, when I first heard that from Alan Wilson's mouth, I was like, well, obviously, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So cool.
And also, I think if Petrie had just twigged that it was Magnus Maximus's campaign, again, I think he would have got that without any problem.
And he might have later down the road.
Absolutely, yeah.
But to be fair to him, it doesn't look like anyone else was handling this stuff in the same sort of care to attention.
No, certainly not in the period in question. Well, not in England. Maybe in Wales, but not in England.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So number 9, the historical triads were compiled from before AD 450 down to the 12th century, but received no accreditations since then. So the triads were recorded in 1450. They were written down for the first time, I think, in 1450. Is that right?
Yeah, sounds about right. Yeah,
sounds about right. So they were recorded, or at least in Latin, in 1450, or or
English, or something, yeah.
And so people have always speculated as to when they end. And he, great bit of logic from him again. There's no mention of Edward I, and I'm sure if they were writing triads,
yes,
they would have recorded Mr. Longshanks.
Yes, probably not very nicely.
Probably not very nicely, but
well, maybe in some places,
yeah, down in the marches, yeah. But I mean, we get loads of poetry from that time, in Welsh verse. So yeah, but I'm sure, and the emotion packed into some of those poems is, about the loss of Llewellyn. It's not something that went unrecorded, but I'm sure we would have had a triad if they were writing them past that point. So number 10 is that the laws of Monmouth show the pagan British civilization at least as early as the Roman age. So what Petrie is doing, I think, is he's taking the British nation and he's taking it to the 1st century. That's as far as he's taken it. He didn't want to say that the Brutus story is older than the 1st century. He's probably careful with that, but he takes it further back than anyone else does, contemporary to him. So it's really good to see that. But he's also saying that the British civilization, we can definitely say from the 1st century, is a cohesive civilization, a nation that we can say exists from that point, which for Petrie's class of person in Britain at the time is very aggressive. So the present requirement for British history, so much neglected, is a scholar in Old Welsh, Breton Irish, and Late Latin accustomed to the paleography, who will deal with an historian and not as an historian and not a mythologist. So he's saying that we're dealing with history written in a way which comes across as myth, which we know, aren't we? So
yes, and we need to do. It's about having the attitude, isn't it? The right attitude.
Yeah, absolutely.
We will deal with these things as historians deal with them, not how mythologists deal with them. And I think this is this last point as well harks back to something I missed off at the end, was that he was infuriated that he could not find copies of these things in English.
Yeah, absolutely.
and he was going, why hasn't anyone translated this? Why are there so few English translations of this? You know, what's going on? What are people playing? You know, what are people playing at? Why isn't this available? You know, he was asking Welsh scholars, English scholars, you know, where is the copies of this in English? And he struggled to find one, I think.
Yeah.
One copy.
Yeah, yeah, which is a real act of negligence, which is clues in the title. He's dealing with something which has been forgotten.
Yes.
Forgotten and actively hidden in other parts of history.
Well, this is he refers to it as negligence, doesn't he?
Negligence.
And I think that's and that possibly maybe he was being purposefully naive.
Yeah, absolutely.
He might have very well known that there were political reasons for this being hidden, but he was just like, let's play it off as negligence. You know, let's just say, oh, we just haven't dealt with it. Let's deal with it now in our modern time where we don't have to worry about archaic politics. You know, this is so far removed from us now. We don't need to worry about that.
I think he's smart.
Yeah.
Smart and doing.
Yes, absolutely. A very smart way of going about it, because it certainly didn't go well for Wilson and Blackett, you know, to talk about the politics of this stuff. You know, they got it in the neck for dealing with the political aspects of this. So, you know, I think maybe it's a very sensible approach that he's gone through with this, but not that it seems to have worked, because we're only just rediscovering this, you know, 100 years later.
Well, I hope that some people get to see this and get some people thinking, because
absolutely,
you know, this is why we do it. This is Sir Flinders Petrie writing about our topic.
Absolutely,
and we couldn't just ignore it, not do anything about that. So I hope you enjoyed that, folks.
Yeah, and I think for those of you who only know about his Egyptology, I hope you're interested in another aspect of his work. And take a look at it for yourselves, because there's so much in it that me and Adam just don't have the time to cover, really. But it's all, and we don't want to just read it verbatim, you know.
No.
Take a good look at it yourself and see what's in it, because this has obviously been underappreciated for 100 years. So it's going to take more than a couple of sets of eyes to really pick everything out of it that's useful.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly that. All right.
Yeah. Cheers, folks.